Welcome everyone to my Halloween edition and my first in a long series of yarn dyeing classes, Dye Yarn Like an Indie Pro. We will be going over different techniques in these classes. There will also be a link in the comments if you feel like donating to me to keep these classes running. Any amount is great and that would be appreciated. We will be doing some other series later on, but first we'll get started with doing this. We're going to go over some of the things you might need in the dyeing class. I will also offer kits if you need them on my webpage, which will also be in the links. Now, this being said, you can buy the kits. You don't have to. You can get your own source of things. I will let you know where you can get stuff, or you can just get the kit and be doing the same thing I'm doing with the class. Which is easy because this is pre-recorded so that you can pause it and go at your own speed. What we're going to start off with is that the powder dyes that we use do go up in the air a bit, so you will need a mask. Right now you can use medical masks, you can make your own mask. As long as they're 3 layers, they should be good enough to block out some of the dust from the dyes. If you're going to be dyeing a lot and you're going into manufacturing and you're around this stuff 24/7, then you might want to look into those big respirator ones with the filters. They are a little hard to get right now with things going on in the world, but it is something to think about down the road. Another thing is, of course you want rubber gloves, because I have been staining many different colors in my life with dyeing. But these will help you just make sure if you're switching colors and whatnot that you rinse them off beforehand so you don't transfer dye on specific yarn colors that you're trying to do. Next, my favorite tool, the poke and stick. So the poke and stick is actually just a chopstick that I got from ordering Chinese food or Vietnamese. These come in handy because you can poke in the dye if you need to, or stir without getting your hands involved, obviously because the water's hot. This method we will be using is the stove method. This is boiling your yarn, but we will go over temperature and stuff like that later. Next thing is these little doodads that look like flying sperm. That's why I call them. These, so far I could only find them on Amazon. I don't always like shopping there, but you get about a 12 pack for $24. They are silicone ties. So sort of like a zip tie, but you can put them around your yarn and make it easier to take out of the pot if you need to, or tie it off and create different kind of creations. So they do come into handy quite a bit, and they're very heat resistant, which is awesome. Next, a very big staple in doing yarn dyeing is having citric acid. Citric acid helps the dye adhere to the yarn and keeps it light fast. It will also, you'll see it in the water, suck on all the dye, and we will do a photograph of that later. Now, I usually get the 10-pound bags. This was I believe a 2-pound or so, but so far my only place I've been able to find this is on Amazon as well. There is places in Hamilton, Ontario that you can get like bigger grades of it for doing bath bombs and stuff. It's a food grade quality, so it basically tastes like sour keys, so don't be eating it all, but it will work. The reason why we use citric acid, you can use vinegar in place of citric acid, but however, you'll need a vinegar with a high acidity, or you will need a lot of it. So they usually say 1 teaspoon, you will need a cup of vinegar to equal the same as this. Some dyes require a little bit more depending on if you're doing special techniques, and then you need to rinse it a lot because the citric acid can make your yarn feel a little stiff after drying. Next, our yarn. So yarn, I usually use a 80/20 superwash merino nylon. This is a sock yarn, but you can dye anything from pure wool, alpaca. These dyes dye anything that's animal protein. So animal protein can be feathers, anything like wool, silk, stuff like that, and they're beautiful. They're very jewel tone as long as you use the right amount of heat. Acid dyes, which I'll talk about now, is that I get them from GNS Dyes in Toronto, Ontario. They're great. They know their products. I find they're fairly consistent, although if you haven't used a color in a while, you might want to order it in and try it to make sure that it's similar if you're keeping to your recipes for dyeing. You can weigh out your dye, you can just sprinkle it on, you can mix a stock, you can do all sorts of things with these. This is the 15-gram jars. They're about $8, which isn't too bad. And depending on your colors, I usually use like a jar up and about after 20 skeins of yarn. Now the dye kits will come with a less amount, but they will come with the amount you need to do whatever you need to do with your dyed yarn. So today we're going to be using 3 colors as well. So the 3 colors here we have is Aztec Gold. We're going to do a nice fall tone yarn. New Orange, which is a nice kind of medium grade orange, and Crimson, which is nice bright red on the cool side, not so orangey colored. So this will be very punchy when we're done. We're going to be using the method where we sprinkle on the dye yarn on top of our yarn. This will create very jewel tones, but you have to be careful how much you use too. Because this is indie dyeing, I don't like to dye anything 100% the same every time. It's art to me. It's like watercolor painting. So I always tell people to let go and just have fun with it. And if your yarn comes out similar, then great, you've got it going on. But don't worry if it's perfect. Have fun with it. Another thing I'd like to add about the yarn is I always pre-soak my yarn, usually before dyeing. You can use a bucket, a bin, Rubbermaid container, sink, anything you need. I always sprinkle in a little bit of citric acid as well, depending on what kind of colors I'm doing. If you're definitely doing a tonal yarn or almost solid, you will want to soak it with citric acid so it absorbs all the dye very well. Sometimes I'll just soak it before I go on, and that's okay too. You can do a bunch of different methods, which we'll get into later in different classes. For this class, I'm just going to soak it under the tap. I'm not worried if it has citric acid in it because I will be adding it in the pot as we go. So we're going to talk about pans that you might need to use for your dyeing your yarn. This pan was a fairly good size. If you're doing 1 or 2 at a time, special tonal, it's nice, you can't stretch it out as much, but you can invest in pans that are a little bit longer. Now, because we're going to be using our own personal stove in our kitchen, you want to be careful of what pans you have, where the dye is going. You want to cover any surfaces like wood that might absorb the dye. As for counters, as long as it's not wood and the dye can't land on it and dissolve, that you might want to just use bleach to clean afterwards or vinegar. The dye does come out, it just takes a little bit. You want to use, you can use those glass top burners that are on their own. The only thing is you just got to make sure your pans are magnetic, because those ones will come off and on as you put your pan on. They're a good alternative if you're working in a basement that you don't want to be around your kitchen. And going from there, talk about a little bit of safety to do with dyeing in your own kitchen. You want to make sure you have no food that the dye will land on, no drinks, open containers, such as that, and to clean everything down before and after you dye. The dye particles can stay in the air. Some people invest in air filters to help, suck the dye in a little bit. Now, if you do work very close over the dye in the pan, the steam will pull down a lot of that dye. So again, the mask to protect you as well. So other than that, you really shouldn't be doing a ton of dyeing in your kitchen. Maybe you find a studio or studio space in your basement perhaps that you could dye massive amounts. I don't do off and on, I do big amounts, but I make sure everything's very clean. But if I were to be going into manufacturing, that's one thing to think about. You want to fill the pan not too high for the application we're going to be doing for this yarn. You want to try and get it around maybe about here, just so it covers the yarn, but it's not going to absorb all the dye and create a muddy mess. However, that being said, sometimes muddy messes come out beautiful. So don't be afraid to play around if you do have too much water. So now we're going to soak our yarn. So like I said, for this application, I'm not going to soak it overnight. I'm just going to soak it under the tap. You want to make sure you get pretty soaking wet. This way it will sink in the water and you're not going to miss areas that might be too bright white. This is probably a thing to know as well. Because when you dye it, sometimes the yarn gets messed up. So you might want to tie these little strings here a little tighter. Depending on your manufacturing, and whoever's doing the yarn, they don't come with anything on them, so you might have to do it yourself. Or just make sure a few of them are snug so you're not going to get it so tangled. And we'll talk about how to organize tangled yarn later when it's wet. So you can use lukewarm water or you can use cold. It doesn't matter at this point. You just don't want to use super hot because we will be going in a lighter or cooler temperature water. You don't want to affect the yarn. It's very hard to felt your yarn, but that being said, it has been happening. If you're working with 100% wool, you want to be even more gentle with the temperatures of your yarn. This yarn, because it has a superwash, it tends to be a little more kind of resilient to that. Placing your yarn in the pan. So people often wonder how you get the back side of your yarn. A lot of times what I'll do is just twist the yarn a little bit so you're getting back and front. So you're not necessarily, you have to flip your yarn if you don't want to. So you'll get a little bit on both. So you just kind of put it in here and try and make it a little bit nice and spread out so that you can get the colors fairly good on here. Like I said, don't worry if it's getting tangled in here right now. We'll talk about that later, how to get it more organized. And don't forget your gloves and mask at this point. Before you even get that kind of going and heated up, you should probably get your gloves on right away. Make sure they're cleaned off, no other remnants of dye from other dyeing jobs. So as for example, I have some black dye that's on these gloves, so I'm going to wash them off before I start. And of course the mask. So before you get into the powder dye, before you open it, you can start getting your yarn nice and hot. We will be adding the citric acid right away to our yarn because I want the colors to stick right away. I don't want them to flow around and be too mixing in with each other. So we get some nice bold colors straight away, but we also get a tiny bit of mixing involved. So we're going to get on our mask. So if I seem muffled at this point, sorry. So once you get your mask on, make sure it's adjusted so that you know you're not going to get dye down in it. After that, then we will start to experiment once this is warmed. So you can turn your burner on to high to start off with, but keep a good look at it and make sure your yarn is not burning. When you burn natural yarn, it is crunchy and weird. You do not want to burn the yarn. So once you get up to temperature, you can put it right to minimum or turn it off. We're going to be doing this fairly quickly so that you get the optimum kind of saturation that you need. So now we're going to add our citric acid. We're going to add a teaspoon or just a good helping teaspoon. Sprinkle that around so you're getting a lot of the yarn covered. Again, we're going to be using the crimson red, so sometimes you need more citric acid. The red is very punchy and you don't want to end up with bleeding colors after. So I'm just going to stir this nice citric acid in here with the yarn. And it's starting to heat up. This might take a couple minutes, but you can get your stuff ready, what colors you want to start off with. We will be starting with our nice Aztec Gold as a base. So this base will also draw the red in, making more orange tones for us as well, working with that nice new orange. Now that the yarn is up to temperature, you want to make sure it's steaming, maybe even bubbling a little bit. This is where you want to turn it down right to minimum. You want to keep that heat because that's what you need for the colors to take very well and to become light fast and absorb into the yarn. So we're going to start with our Aztec Gold here. So I always open up above my yarn because I don't care where it goes at this point, just in case you get little pieces coming off the cap because they do get kind of messy. And then I just put a little bit into the cap, about this much here. Okay, so then you can kind of sprinkle all across the yarn. You want to get it fairly covered in this because we're going to use it as our base for the colors we're working with now. So as you can see, if you get some speckled texture you want and you're not too concerned about going everywhere, you can leave it. It's up to you. It can make a really interesting yarn. At this point, I'm going to leave it because I like how it's coming around. If you don't like it, you can start poking it with your stick to get more into the yarn down around. This is a great way of getting it just saturated enough that you have like concentration and you got some lighter areas as well. Next, so like I said, you kind of have to work quickly with this kind of style of yarn. Next, I'm going to do the orange, the new orange here. And again, same thing. This almost looks like Aztec Gold, but it does come out more orangey. I'm going to put a decent amount in there. I don't want to totally saturate this with orange though. Hence, we don't want to get rid of the colors that we're putting in. We're going to just sprinkle a little bit in certain areas, maybe some white areas that you notice. That being said, when we use the red, it will also create some oranges as well, since we're using yellow as a base. What's nice about working with dyes, they kind of similarly work with watercolors as well, like in color matching. You can over dye and create all sorts of intense colors on their own by matching colors together. So it's always good, if you're not great with color, maybe look up a color wheel or look up inspiration on Pinterest. You can type in yarn and see what other people are combining color wise. So now we're going to use a little bit of the crimson. We're going to use the crimson more as a speckly kind of red. Now crimson's usually finely ground, I find, so it's hard to get a nice speckle, but as you can see, we're getting quite a nice speckle on our own with the orange and the Aztec gold. So now we're just going to add a tiny little bit of red. We don't want too much. That's actually too much, so go back. This is where you can measure as well if you have a scale for ounces. The reason why I don't measure is because I like to paint. This is my painting. If I do have colorways that I do all the time, I do keep measurements and what portions of water to dye that I need to create the same kind of colorways again. Again, indie yarn's not about that. It's about being really awesome and creating art all at the same time. So I'm going to add just a little sprinkle. Go lightly, because that red may come out quick. I'm just going to add it in some areas that, there. Even if you don't use it all, you can put it back, and voila. If you want to get even finer with it, you could dish it out on the end of the chopstick here as well. Some people invest in little kind of sifts for as well if you're really big into the sparkles. Or not sparkles, but sprinkles. Other than that, we're getting quite a nice dotted effect here. We're not getting too much saturation all over the yarn. We're keeping some colors separate, so this will come out quite nicely. Once you're done that, you just let it cool. So you turn it off and you let it cool, and you can start seeing some of the dyes absorbing into the yarn. Eventually, the water will be almost totally clear once it's cooled. If you're doing yarn quickly, you might want to leave it for about 20 minutes, come back. If it's still warm, you can dump it out that time into the sink. Now, that being said, you might have a little bit of color still in the water. If you want to get rid of that, you can add more citric acid if you want on top. But I don't want to disturb what kind of colorway we've got going right now because it's very nice. So we've let this cool a little bit. It's still a little warm. I do like the color that's happening, so I may dump it now. As you can see, without dumping it, it's still got a bit of yellow and orange in there, but that's okay. We're just going to rinse it, and it should rinse clear there. I like what's going on here. We did get a shot of that, so that's good. We got some little, as I like to call them, sprinkles, but speckles happening in here. So now we'll dump it out and see what the yarn looks like. So as you can see, the yarn's still quite a bit hot, but you can see the lovely colors that we're getting in here and those little specks and different reds, oranges, and the Aztec gold, which concentrated looks more like a nice tan brown. So this is a great fall yarn for today. We are going to gently cool it down. So set your water for like a medium, and then we can spray it down. So I'm going to give an example of this right now. As you see, it's rinsing pretty clear. We still will hand wring it just a bit, but right now we don't want to agitate the yarn too much, just in case you end up felting it or making it slightly fuzzy. We do not want that. So once you get it to what you want, just check it over, make sure there's no blobs of powdered dye or anything, since we are working with more of a concentrated. But as you can see, we're getting some beautiful colors and flecks in there, ranging from more of a pinky tone red to the nice yellow and gold tone oranges. One of my favorite spots right there, and right in there. So now we're gonna just give it a good hand washing. I do suggest a little bit of soap. I like to use a conditioner. Conditioners will make it a little bit softer for you if you're working with a rougher yarn. I just use it to clean up maybe leftover loose dye that we didn't quite get out there. You can get it at the dollar store. Great way to be cost effective for you. So give it a couple squirts and then kind of massage the yarn gently. You don't want to agitate it too much, but just to wash off the leftover citric acid and dyes. And it smells great too. Some wools tend to smell like sheep poop. So once you've massaged it in, you're going to rinse it again. So I'm just going to show that. Once you've rinsed it and you feel that the rinse is out, you may want to switch to your hands at that point, just to make sure you got all the soap out, because it's kind of, obviously, you can't feel with the gloves on. So make sure there's no dye on your gloves before you put them anywhere. Yeah, and it feels pretty good there. So now we're gonna get it kind of drained out there. So I like to fold in half and then just give it a little wring. You don't have to be too tough, but you want to just get out those last little bit of water. At this point, if you've got tangled yarn, do not touch it. Wait till it fully dries. And by being a little tighter in these areas, you can give it a good yank to try and get it a little more organized without taking out anything like I just did. So next we're going to dry it in the salad spinner. Yes, I said salad spinner. It is great for getting off some loose water and helping your drying time go faster. So at this point, putting in the salad spinner, you just want to make sure it's even so you're not going to have it go all over the place and be hard to spin out the water. So you want to do this about 2 times before hanging to dry. So give it a good spin. And then slow it down and take out the basket and dump the water, the excess water. So that's a lot of excess water that you didn't even know it was there. It felt kind of dry when we wring it out. So we're going to do it again. You can do more times if you want to really get your drying time settled. But I do it about twice. So sometimes after you do the salad spinner, if your ties are a little loose, you may want to just check it over, make sure it's not too tangled. And from this point, you can hang it to dry in your bathroom. You can hang it to dry in a basement. Just make sure it's not too damp. You want it to dry fairly quickly. I find the winter or the summer outside is really quick. The winter's good if you have your heat on. It will dry it up nice and quick. From there, you have beautiful yarn to use, and all you have to do is wind it up. So as for color, as you can see, the colors are nice and bold. You got your little bit of specks in there.